In a sense, all the information is out there. It's in different places, and there's no defined way to bring it all together so that we can make intelligent decisions.
Hey, welcome to Unleashed. I'm your host, Will Bachman. Unleashed is produced by Umbrex, the first global community connecting top-tier independent management consultants with one another. We just heard from today's guest, Jim McEachern, an independent consultant who has been working with the Alliance for Telecommunications Industry Solutions, or ATIS or ATIS, on developing technology to cut down on robocalls. For years, I've been wondering why telecommunications companies haven't done more to eliminate robocalls. So when I saw Jim quoted in a New York Times article about his work, I reached out to him. I was so pleased that Jim agreed to be on the show to talk about his work and explain to me how spoofing works and why the existing technology has made it so hard to fight robocalls. I also learned a practical tip. Whenever I get a robocall, I have been in the habit of blocking that phone number on my phone. Jim explained to me that I'm probably just wasting my time since robocallers often use a different spoofed number on each outbound call. In the show notes, you'll find a link to the New York Times article where I first heard of Jim's work, a link to the ATIS website that has more info on the protocols that Jim discusses on the show, and Jim's LinkedIn profile. Finally, before we get into the episode proper, I'd like to welcome listeners Amit B., Rashid K., Noel G., and Nora G., who have recently signed up for the weekly Unleashed email. If you'd like to receive the transcript of each episode, plus other bonus features right in your inbox, email me at unleashed@umbrex.com. Hello, Jim. Welcome to the show.
Great to be here.
Jim, I saw you quoted in the New York Times in this article about robocalls, and it is a topic that I've just been curious about for years, but why these things are so hard to stop. And I was so delighted that you agreed to come on the show here to talk about it. So how is it even possible to spoof numbers?
Well, thanks for having me here. So you're right. That's the question I get lots of times. People will go, well, I don't know how I can go into my mobile phone and there's no secret screen that lets me change my numbers. How can how does this even happen? And you're right. If you have a landline, it's hardwired to the telephone company. They put in your caller ID. Your cell phone, same thing. So you can't. But where you can is if you're a business. The business actually has equipment they call private branch exchanges or PBXs that will basically bring a line into the business and serve all of the desks that they have in the business. And with that equipment, you in fact can insert the number that you want to appear on the outgoing calls. And so that's basically where it's being spoofed. It's being spoofed with that kind of business type equipment.
Okay, so how is this even allowed?
Yeah, and that's exactly it. So why, you can't do it as an individual. Why are you allowed to do it as a business? Well, in fact, there are a number of very legitimate reasons for business. Well, one of the reasons, first of all, I guess I should say, is that it's been that way for 50, 60 years. I mean, without the time machine, we would be hard to do a hard reset. And so businesses have been allowed to do this forever, but they have very legitimate reasons for doing that. And so an obvious one, your business, do you want the number to appear when people call back? Do you want that to be the individual's desk? Or do you want that to be the receptionist so that they can screen the calls for all the people in your business? It'll depend on your business. Do you want it to be the 800 number so that they can do a toll-free callback? If you are a national company and you're calling about something from a central location, would you rather have a local callback number in every city that they can call? Again, depending on your business, you legitimately may want one or the other of these situations. There are also scenarios, just if I can, where like a smaller entities, not quite personal but close, well, actually personal uses. And the good example that I've heard for that is the case of a veterinarian. And on the weekend, they get a call, someone's dog is sick, and they're going, should I panic and take them into the emergency room, or should I just wait and bring them into the office, into the clinic on Monday morning? And the vet calls back to give them, to assess the situation and give them an answer. Well, the vet is probably out and about and using her mobile phone, her personal mobile phone to call. They don't want their personal mobile phone number to appear. They want the office number to appear, and therefore they would legitimately spoof that. So it gives you an idea that there are many, many legitimate reasons for doing that, and that's why it's allowed.
Okay, so I totally got that. So I totally understand, IBM, they have an office. They should be allowed to have like a number that when someone dials out, it comes from like the number that appears on my screen would be just sort of the general number to the IBM operator. Okay, I got it. Or any legitimate business. But why is it so hard for the telecom? So I got that. But I would think that the telephone company would know all of these phone calls are coming from like this business, right? And if the people were all complaining about it, then they'd be able to track it down and say, trace the wires back somehow and figure out that it was coming from this scammer. So could you talk a little bit about like why it's been so hard for telcos to block all of these illegal scams?
Yeah. So there's several questions in there. So I'll kind of try and tease them apart and address them. One thing that's worth pointing out is that take the case of the IBM with the business office. Well, IBM doesn't send all the calls to a single phone company. They probably have two carriers that they use for redundancy and for cost and all those things. But they only got the phone number from one carrier. The other telco, they may not know that number is a legitimate IBM number. So there is some ambiguity there. But the bigger problem is that it's a good place to contrast phone scams with email spam. And with email spam, you get the whole message, you can scan it, you can look at, you can compare it with other scams, and then you can make a decision, is this a scam or is this not a scam? The problem with phone calls is that you don't know that for sure until the person answers. And at that point, if we're lucky, we recognize it as a scam, and you say, okay, you could mark that as a scam, and then we'll know that all the calls coming from that are the scam in the future, or are scams in the future, and warn other people. Of course, that's at the terminating end, the receiving end of the phone call. But at that point, you don't know if that number that appeared was a true number or if it had been spoofed, as we discussed before. It's just you don't know. You know it's a scam, but you don't know that. However, if you go to the start of the phone call, at that point, they actually do know if the number's been spoofed or not, or they in many cases, they know it hasn't been spoofed. Again, if it's your landline or your mobile phone, they know it hasn't been spoofed. If it's coming from IBM, they know it's coming from IBM, and you're right, they could do the trace back, but they have no way today of giving that information to the originating, the beginning point, or sorry, the end point on the call, so they can connect the dots. So you're right, in a sense, all the information is out there. It's just it's in different places, and there's no defined way to bring it all together so that we can make intelligent decisions. And that is essentially the insight that we came to as we were developing Shaken, and we built it around, okay, how do we make that possible?
Okay, so what is Shaken, and how is it going to address this problem?
So basically, it begins with, again, what I said, what the originating service provider telco knows at the beginning of the call. So if it's coming from your mobile phone or your landline, they know the number to put in there, and they know that absolutely, and they can take that, okay, this number is the true number. If it's coming from IBM, and as we discussed, they're allowed to spoof the number, they know it's IBM, but I didn't check the number. I'm not saying it's not legitimate, I just haven't checked it. And then there's other cases where a call is coming from another non-IP carrier where you just know where it entered your network. We'll leave that aside for the moment. So that originating telco, they then take what they know, at whichever level, and they create a digital signature with the phone number in there, the level of confidence they have in it, what they know about it, and they then cryptographically sign that digital signature, and they send that along with the call to wherever the call ends. And then at the other end, they can then verify that, again, cryptographically. And then at the other end, they know exactly what they know at the beginning, and they can bring all the pieces together. And they also, I mean, you alluded before to the kind of trace it back to the beginning. The other thing that this does is that they, when they verify that signature, they can see exactly which telco signed it in the first place. So they, in fact, know where the origin was. So if they do need to trace back for law enforcement or whatever, they know exactly where to go. And that's, at a high level, in a nutshell, what Shaken does is it takes that information that you already kind of knew in a distributed sense, but allows you to reliably and cryptographically securely send it along with the call so that you know it at the other end.
Okay. So let's say currently today, before the Shaken gets implemented, like just today, I get, like probably everybody in America, multiple of these robocalls every day, even though I'm on the do not call list and stuff. So, you get one that says like this robot voice is like, "This is Jamie Dimon at JP Morgan. Your account has been compromised." Or it'll be like, "This is the IRS," or something. So let's say that I get one this morning, right? From who claiming to be Apple, saying that my iCloud has been compromised. My service provider is AT&T. So if I call, theoretically right now, if I said to AT&T right after call, "Hey, that person that just called me, that was a spammer," where would AT&T be able to trace that back to? Would it theoretically currently be possible to actually trace that back to the computer or the office that sent that call? Or is it currently actually impossible to get all the way back to figure out who the source of that call was?
No, it is, with some caveats, it is in fact possible today to trace it back. And the industry has been cooperating to do exactly that. A number of the major service providers are working together to allow you to do that. The catch is it's still a fairly manual process to do that. And basically what it does is your provider's AT&T, you call them up, you say, "I just got this clearly scam call." And then AT&T looks at their records and they say, "Okay, this call came into you at this time. It said it was from here. Look at our records. Oh, we got it from Verizon." So then they go to Verizon. They say, "Okay, you handed a call over to us at 11:56, and this morning it had da-da-da-da. Where did it come from?" And Verizon looks at theirs and they say, "Oh, I got it from T-Mobile." And calls do get routed through these multiple carriers in this way. And then they need to go to the next one, and they go step by step back through each one, needs to look through the records and correlate it and say, "Okay, yeah, that's a call. Okay, I got it from here." And eventually you get back to the origination of that call. And yes, that is as complicated and as awkward as it sounds. But in fact, most of the enforcements that have been happening of late have used that to identify the source of the calls. But again, with that level of complexity, you need to be going after fairly big fish to make it worth your while. That's going to get a whole lot easier with Shaken.
The source of these calls, is it mostly a computer that is based in the US somewhere, or is it concentrated in some country overseas? I never stay on long enough to get transferred to a human, right? But are these just being all kind of created by, a computer somewhere? And then where would they trace it back to?
How do I say this? So basically, many of them are computer initiated. A lot of it is voice over IP, mainly because of the cost and the efficiencies around the equipment and such. But the other thing is, let's take a typical scenario. You actually get connected through the agent, or they come on right away. And it's clear that this is not someone who's an American, down the street. The accent gives it away instantly. And so you think, okay, that call's coming from international wherever. So we couldn't trace it back all the way to there. The trick is that the way that call likely came is there's a call center in India or Uzbekistan or wherever with call agents at it, but they connect over the internet to a piece of computer equipment in the U.S., and that piece of computer equipment in the U.S. actually dials and initiates the call. And when they connect to you, then over the internet, it goes from that equipment back to the call center or wherever. And the reason it does that is that international calls are still expensive. The internet connectivity is cheap. The local call from the computer equipment in the States is easy to set up and is cheap. And so they do it that way for cost effectiveness. The good news in all that roundabout explanation is that when you trace back, you'll come to some entity that signed up for service with some local telco and has an entry point into the network there. And so you do have at least something domestically that you can latch onto and trace it back to, and then use that as a entry point to find out who is really behind it, no matter where the agents actually are.
So one thing that I've been doing is when I get these calls, I will go and say, okay, block this number on my iPhone. But maybe I'm just wasting my time doing that. If they're spoofing the numbers every time, do they end up just kind of reusing those spoofed numbers? Or if they're like just randomizing the phone number each time, maybe I'm just wasting my time blocking it.
Yeah, you definitely are.
I am. Okay, so I'm just wasting my time. So all these blocked numbers, it's not like they're going to call me from that one again. They're going to call me from a different one.
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, if you're lucky, you're wasting your time. If you're unlucky, you're actually blocking a legitimate number. They never called you, but if they try to call you again, they'll be blocked because of that. And that, by the way, as an individual phone number, that's not, the chances of you actually blocking someone that you really want to talk to are slim, right? It's just wasted time. But there are a number of call blocking apps, the analytic engines that actually will block calls on your behalf, and they're crowdsourcing that information. And that's something they need to really be careful about, because if they start seeing a bunch of calls, spoof calls coming, or calls coming from a given number that turn out to be fraud or spam, and they then flag that as a suspicious number, if it in fact was spoofed, then they may be, for a bunch of consumers, blocking all calls from that number. And so they need to put in mechanisms when they do blacklist those numbers to recognize that, that actually shouldn't have been blacklisted and we need to take it off.
Yeah. I mean, I have one of those Nomo Robo that kind of works, although since it seems like all the spammers have shifted to spoofing, that it hasn't been working as well recently.
Yeah, that's one of the things that so those services actually, I'd say they work surprisingly well, given that the calls can be spoofed. And, to that extent, they kind of work until they start working, and then the scammers work out a way around it because they can spoof, right? Mm-hmm. And once we get Shaken in, right now those services are built on a foundation of sand, essentially, because that number can be spoofed. Shaken will provide a concrete foundation for those to build on. And so you'll find they will work far better once Shaken is widely deployed.
So Shaken, let me see if I kind of captured it. So the originating telco, in our case, let's say that if the person is in India or Uzbekistan, like you said, the PBX is some computer here in the United States, then so that call coming out of the computer in the United States, that would be the originating telco. So that originating telco would generate some kind of cryptographic digital signature saying this call came from like this particular phone PBX located in XYZ Florida or something, like in some given town, right? Like at this address. Yeah. So this is the address that this came from. and they would send that digital code all the way through along with the phone call so that the receiving company would know that digital signature. So if the receiving company gets a complaint from their customer, they can say, okay, this digital signature, this is someone at this is a bad actor at that particular PBX.
Yes. And then in addition, the No More Robo or Haya or whichever one of the call blocking apps, if they were part of that call, they would then know, yes, calls from that particular PBX in the future, it's now a known scam.
Mm-hmm.
And if you decide to prosecute, and you went to the FTC, they would know exactly what address or billing address, at least, to look for the people at. So you're right. It starts connecting the dots.
So what would the digital signature actually tell us? If I could take one of these digital signatures and decipher it, what actual information would it contain?
It contains the number that you want for the caller ID, and then it has a confidence level. We call it attestation level, which is a word that I've used a lot in the last few years, and I don't think I had ever used in my life before then. And if we have full attestation or A-level attestation, that means this is the number of that person, or the number that person has a legitimate right to use. So you can believe that number. If it's the IBM example we gave, where I know the customer, but I didn't check the number, they give it B or partial attestation. But in that case, they then take that business location and they give it a unique identifier. We call it an origination identifier or Orig ID. Think of it as a serial number associated with that customer location. And then they send it along. And so if you're trying to build a reputation or trace back, that Orig ID is the one that will point to a specific customer. And then I mentioned briefly if it came from another carrier that wasn't IP, because this only works with Shaken only works with voice over IP stuff. With the legacy TDM or legacy networks, it doesn't work, alas, but they're all being discontinued. If it came from one of those networks, then you would give it a C level or a gateway attestation that just says, this is where it came into my network. But that would still tell you the carrier that delivered it to you. So better than nothing.
What has to happen for Shaken to get implemented? Is this something that Congress has to legislate, or is it something that the industry association is just kind of agreeing and going ahead and doing on their own?
The industry has been moving for some time to doing it on its own. The FCC has made it very clear that they're watching and that they expect the industry to keep pressing ahead. I think the implication is that, and by the way, if you don't, we'll explain it to you properly. So the industry is deploying at speed. In fact, it's in most of the major networks today and rolling out, and a number of people are having calls signed. Again, it's still percentage-wise relatively small, but it's happening, and the intent is that it'll be largely deployed and operational by the end of this year. Canada is also in the process of deploying, a little bit further behind, but they're on track to deploy as well.
All right. That's awesome, actually. Is this going to work for international calls?
It's so in the fullness of time, yes. In the short term, when we developed the initial specification, it only took a single country view, and various practical reasons for that. I mean, mainly just that it was a complex enough problem, only looking at one country without making it more complicated. Earlier this year, because Canada and the U.S. were both in the process of deploying, we initiated a work activity to specify how it would work if you had multiple countries. So that if a call was signed in Canada and verified in the U.S., it would work. And that document that specifies how that would operate, in fact, has recently been agreed, and it's currently being letter balloted for approval. So that will be, before the end of this year, in place. The only caveat I would put in is that for countries with similar legal and regulatory regimes like Canada and the US, this will work fine. If you want to put in the UK and the EU and Japan and ones like that, it will work just fine. It won't be a good model to take you all the way to all the 190 some countries in the world, where you get into countries with very different legal systems and regulations and different levels of trust. And so we recognize that there will be a long-term solution to needs to be fleshed out to get us to all countries, but that's future. We've got something for the initial bulk of the countries that are likely to deploy, and a plan for the longer term.
What will you see on your phone when you have an incoming call when this thing, when Shaken is implemented? Will there be some kind of green check mark or something that's been verified, or any kind of trust indicator?
Yeah, very good question. That's one of the areas that the industry hasn't yet reached a consensus on. I think that depending on the carrier you're with, in the short term, you may well see a check mark. Others worry that because people won't understand it, that could actually confuse them and cause them to not trust the whole system, and that's why there's a debate going on. There are a few patterns that are starting to emerge from that, though, so I can give you an idea of what I think those messages are and what's likely to happen. One thing is that what Shaken verifies is the number, right? It doesn't say anything about the name or the intent, because a scammer can get a real phone number and make calls, and they would be fully verified, and it would still be a scam call. It'd be easier to track down and stop, but nonetheless, they could do it. So if you do have a check mark, then one of the suggestions is that check mark should be very clearly associated with the number. And if you have a name on there, have it separate, because you haven't verified the name, you've just verified the number. And that you only would give if you do give a check mark, you'd only give it with a full attestation, because this is actually from this number. Another thing that has been suggested is that if you want to give an indication this is a scam that's likely, you should not do that just on the basis of Shaken, because again, you're just verifying the number. You don't know anything about the intent. Where you do get some idea of intent is with the analytics. You mentioned No More Robo, and they can start, and they already do start, indicating it's spam likely. And so that kind of negative indication, that, if it's going to come in, would only come in after you'd added in the analytics that took the number and other information and said, ooh, this fits a pattern, looks suspicious. Those are the two key things. But again, it's being actively studied. A number of telcos have user trials where they're showing users different things and getting the reaction. Did you understand what that meant? Is this useful? And as that continues to deploy and we get some experience, we're working to distill that down into some concise guidelines, which then would go out to the entire industry so that we do all the same thing and don't confuse people.
You mentioned showing the name of the caller. I think I've seen on some landlines, or maybe it's some VoIP systems, some people's phones, when a phone comes in that's not in their contacts, you actually still get like the actual name of the caller, like the phone number plus the name of the caller, right?
Yeah.
But I don't get that on my cell phone. Like, could you just explain that? Is that something that, how does it happen that some people see that information of the name of the caller, not just when it's in your own phone book, but just like it's being provided by the originating phone company? How does that work? And why can't I get it?
It works a couple of different ways. So one of the things is that the calling name is in the U.S. defined as a terminating service. So basically, the name is not inserted when you start the call; just the number is inserted, and when you get to the termination, then basically the end carrier accesses a database somewhere that tells it, okay, this number is associated with this name. And there are competitive databases for that to do that. But of course, since it's a service you need to dip the number. There's costs associated, and then some carriers do it and some don't. My suspicion, I don't know for a fact, but my suspicion is you're less likely to do it with a mobile phone because you do in fact have your contact list that has most of the calls that will matter. Whereas with landlines, you don't have that contact list in the same way. I will also point out, just to confuse it even further, is that different countries have different processes. So, for example, in Canada, the name is actually inserted by the originating carrier, so that it just comes through, and you don't have to worry about it no matter what.
So there is a database. So I mean, I have AT&T. So if AT&T wanted to, they could offer that as a service, right? They could say, "Hey, Will, you can pay an extra whatever $10 a month or something, and then whenever you get an incoming call, even if it's not in your address book, we'll tell you the name of the person associated with that phone number."
It could. I mean, and by the way, when you say there's a database, there are multiple databases, which is one of the complications. Is that there's ones by the carriers and then various other competing ones. But at least conceptually, yes, they could. I don't know whether the specific equipment supports it or not, but yeah, conceptually, absolutely.
So, but some carriers do that. Like, I don't know who it is, but it seems like some VoIP or some landline companies will actually, like at a business, you can see who's calling, right?
Yeah, the VoIP and landline ones, I think it's fairly common. And again, it's fairly common because if they didn't have that, they would not see the name for anyone. And that is, at least it used to be, typically a paid service where you would pay for name display. All
right. Well, AT&T, if you're listening, I would pay like $10 a month easy if you offer that as an extra service. So
I think you'll get a call shortly.
Yeah, AT&T, please add that. That would be awesome. I mean, maybe even $20 a month. It'd be so useful to know who's calling you, right? Okay, but back to what we're talking about. Have the phone companies resisted this a bit? I mean, I imagine to some degree, if these spammers are paying phone bills, that's a pretty decent volume of phone calls. Maybe the phone companies are saying, actually, I don't mind getting the revenue from all these spammers.
No, and I've heard that suggestion before. But basically, at least the phone companies that we've been working with, back up. The shaken specification was developed by the industry, led predominantly by the phone companies who were developing the specification. So they were doing the work to come up with a solution. And if you think about it, they recognize that it's in their interest to stop all these scammers, because even if some carriers are picking up a little bit of revenue from all these calls, it undermines trust in the phone network. And if trust in the phone network disappears, people will stop using the phone, and that's not a good thing. And I think that the at least enlightened phone companies have long recognized that it is absolutely in their interest to stop this problem and to do what they can. And the reason it's taken so long is because it's a complex problem. As I went through the various legitimate scenarios and what we know and don't know, it's not a simple problem, and that's why it's taken as long as it has.
Have there been regulatory barriers to doing something like shaken? Maybe there's some FCC rules against providing this information to the receiving carrier, that something like that had to change?
No, not around shaken. There certainly, if you were saying that the carrier should just spot these things, this is clearly a whole bunch of problem calls coming, because of some pattern that, in the calling that clearly looks like it's a robocall, they should just block it and not let it go through. That they can't do. The carriers have to complete the calls, right? So again, the FCC is now allowing them to block calls at the network level under very specific circumstances. So, for example, if the caller ID shows all zeros, well, you go, that's clearly not a number I can dial. So that's clearly something going wrong. And so the FCC has just in the last couple of years allowed them to block for that. And they are expanding the range of circumstances under which they can block on behalf of the user. Shaken doesn't block the calls, and that's a good thing. So Shaken isn't going to solve this problem all on its own. If you look at what you're doing in Shaken with the signature and the verification, it just gives you more information. It's an enabler that will allow you to do other stuff with it later. And so for deploying Shaken, no, it's just the cost and the time to define it in the right way.
But building what you're saying, it sounds like current regulations would prohibit the originating telco from doing analytics to say, hey, there's this PBX that's sending out like calls every 10 seconds and lots of these calls get hung up on within the first 5 seconds. So, some kind of like doing some analytics to suggest this PBX is a probable spammer. We're going to go shut them down. Most calls get probably hung up on. They're doing a ton of calls. It has some sort of, it looks like they're being automated. They're not allowed to do that analytics on their own customers now?
We're getting into an area that's a little outside my area of expertise, so just take it with a little bit of grain of salt, but I can comment a little bit on it. So if they were just to do that analytics and just block it, then I think that would in fact run afoul of the regulations. However, what they can do is that this is a customer that they signed a contract with, right? They signed them up. And if they spot that this customer is doing a lot of stuff that looks highly suspicious, then in fact, it would be appropriate for them to go and say, so, I don't think we like your business, or can you explain to us why we should still continue to offer you service? And in fact, within the last month, a number of the attorneys general, and the telcos issued a press release that basically, in fact, was the article, New York Times article you saw me quoted in, was about that, where they're encouraging the telcos, and the telcos are saying it's a good idea, to provide extra due diligence in investigating the people who say they want to sign up as customers if they're going to be generating a whole bunch of traffic. And so don't just the fact that they waive a credit card shouldn't be enough to automatically allow them to be one of your customers. And so that's I think the way that they get around it. They don't just block it. They say, nah, that doesn't sound like a legitimate reason to make calls. Because just to clarify, once a call is on the network, there's an obligation to complete it. I don't believe there's an obligation for you to accept every customer who says they want to sign up with you.
Got it. So a little bit kind of analogous to the financial industry with know your customer laws of saying, like, how many calls are you going to make a month? All right. And
that's exactly what it is. And in fact, there's a number of related variations in that theme in the telco industry that they use exactly that terminology, the know your customer, and how do you know? Yes.
So this has been a super helpful, intro to Shaken. Could you give us a little bit about you and your role in this? And you've been a consultant in this space for a while. About what's been your role in kind of helping the industry come up with this? Yeah.
So I'll give a bit about myself and I'll set a bit of context. So you're right. I've been consulting primarily for the Alliance for Telecommunications Industry Solutions, or ATIS, as we call it, which is it's an association that has broad representation across all aspects of the telecommunications industry. So all kinds of carriers, landline, mobile, cable, over the top, Google and Skype kind of services, as well as the equipment providers and the system integrators. They all come together to solve problems like this. And they come together because this is something where if AT&T came up with their solution, and Verizon came up with their solution, and T-Mobile came up with their solution, it would work great for calls within their networks, but if you had a call that originated in one network and the other one, it wouldn't work. So cooperation makes perfect sense. So I've been consulting with them for a number of years on a range of problems that fit that description. A number of years back, the one that bubbled up was, or one of the problems that came up was the whole robocalling and what we do about it. How do we come up with mitigation techniques? And out of that grew the initiative that became Shaken. At the time, it was one of half dozen things that I was involved in. And of course, over time, it expanded and it gained momentum to the point where it was the only thing that I was basically doing because it was had such visibility and was so important. My role, so the technical stuff is largely driven by the industry. So the Comcast, AT&T, and others, they were providing the technical stuff in to define this. And I, representing the industry, was just kind of helping. Now, in practice, being at the table for all the discussions, I was obviously part of those discussions, and I hope shaped it a little bit as well. But mainly just helping the industry collectively move forward to solve their problems. Does that give you a sense?
It does. Give us a little bit of a story of what's it take for an industry to agree on some kind of technical standard like this. What are some of your lessons learned or observations from seeing that whole process?
Mainly I think it starts with a recognition that these are problems that we need to come up with a single solution. They're not problems that can be addressed by competitive market-driven solutions. And again, there's very distinct types of problems that fit into that. So once the industry recognizes that, then it's just having a forum a neutral forum where they can come together. Some of the things that are important for that neutral forum to work are ensuring that everyone's voice is heard. So if people come in with some idea and they're shut out, that's not going to be helpful. So fair, neutral processes, everyone's voice is heard, and a mechanism for determining a consensus. And consensus is not the same as everyone getting exactly what they wanted, but how do you identify a consensus that balances all the needs and emerges as an industry consensus?
Yeah, well, I imagine that some technical options that might have been slightly more favorable for one carrier versus another. Maybe option A would have been cheaper for Comcast and more expensive for AT&T, and option B would be the reverse. What was the mechanism that they used to say, maybe ahead of time, like, this is how we're going to vote and get consensus, and I don't know, if 7 out of 10 of us vote yes, then we'll all agree to do it ahead of time or something like so. What was the mechanism to get to agreement?
So there is a well-defined voting process at the end to determine whether or not it passes, but there's a strong desire or process, strong mechanism, mindset to ensure that wherever possible, you don't get to that, count the votes up and winners and losers. In general, you want to have something that actually comes up with some objective ways. And so it's not exactly what you're getting at, but there were a couple of times you got into areas where there were some significant costs. And one of the principles that was put forward is that, okay, if this mechanism has a potential for additional revenue and it is going to induce additional cost, we should try and align it so that the person who gets the extra revenue is the one that gets the extra cost. Whereas if this other approach, yes, the carrier that starts a call has to pay all the money, but the carrier that terminates it gets all the revenue, or vice versa. That's not an ideal solution. So those kinds of principles, which it's pretty hard to object to, create an objective set of criteria for helping to encourage a working consensus.
Yeah, that makes sense. So there'd be kind of different ways that it could have been structured. What about things like, I don't know, but I imagine that some things might not be completely variable, that maybe some things are sort of a fixed cost for any carrier to implement, regardless of your size. So, for a really small carrier, it'd be kind of tough. And for a big carrier, it would be peanuts. So was there kind of explorations around how do we divide the cost up so it's fair?
So the reason I'm hesitating is that this is all driven by concrete proposals, right? So if someone just complains that something is problematic or difficult, that's one thing. Because what do you do? So what? I mean, because there's going to be cost no matter what you do. But when people come in with a concrete alternative proposal, that's when you can do that kind of analysis. And yes, you worry about the size of the carriers. Where that came in a major way was when we looked at the governance structure for how do you control who gets the certificates and how do you ensure it's secure. And in that, we looked very carefully at, okay, we want to make sure we put in something that distributes the costs and the voice evenly, so that no one is left holding all the cost or not having a voice. So it depends on where you fit. But yes, and again, we count very much on people presenting their view, and if they don't like something, then coming back with a concrete proposal, because just, well, that sucks, doesn't take you too far.
Yeah.
Saying, I hate that. How about this wording? Well, now you can have a sensible debate, right?
Who owns the IP or for this? So, or is it like nobody gets the patent, or does some industry association get the patent on it so that everybody can use it for free or something?
Yeah, there's no patents on this. This is all done under a committee. It's called the IPNNI, stands for Internet Protocol Network Interface Working Group between ATIS and the SIP Forum, which is another association. They developed this, and under the IPR rules for that, anyone who has IPR would have had to declare it up front, and then that would have been factored into selection. Because again, if you had two proposals, one that was encumbered with IPR, the other that wasn't, that would make a difference in your solutions. But in fact, no one declared IPR that was essential to this, and it's basically unencumbered with IPR, and knock yourself out and deploy as quickly as possible.
Great. What's the best place for people who want to kind of keep track of this issue, to follow it and learn more? Is there a website you want to point people to, or?
Yes, there's, under ATIS website, which is atis.org, there is a website for the Governance Authority, the Secure Telephone Identity Governance Authority, and it has a number of links to progress into the standards. There's a test bed that ATIS and Newstar have been running that allow people to bring their implementations in and make sure they work, and those are largely all linked in there.
Fantastic. Well, Jim, this has been really interesting to hear how this is playing out, and I thank you personally for your work to help prevent the robocalls that I won't be getting in the future after this is implemented.
I'm glad I could talk to you, and I'm looking forward to having them stop too.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Jim.
Okay, thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Unleashed, the show that explores how to thrive as an independent professional. Unleashed is sponsored by Umbrex, the world's first global community of top-tier independent management consultants. The mission of Umbrex is to create opportunities for independent management consultants to meet, share lessons learned, and collaborate. I'd love to get your feedback and hear any questions that you'd like to see us answer on this show. You can email me at unleashed@umbrex.com. That's UMBREX.com. If you found anything on the show helpful, it would be a real gift if you would let a friend know about the show and take a minute to leave a review on iTunes, Google Play, or Stitcher. And if you subscribe, our show will get delivered to your device every Monday. Our audio engineer is Dave Nelson. Our theme song was composed by Gary Negbauer, and I'm your host, Will Bachman. Thanks for listening.